Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault tonight. You arrived just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you are listening from. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You stand inside a medieval cottage somewhere in northern Europe. Perhaps England, perhaps the edge of France, perhaps a village that vanished centuries ago beneath fields and sheep paths. The exact place hardly matters. Winter has claimed all of them equally. The room smells of damp wool, old smoke, and yesterday's stew. You notice the walls first. Thick timber beams lean slightly inward as though exhausted from holding back too many winters already. Mud plaster fills the gaps unevenly. Here and there, small cracks breathe threads of cold air into the room. The wind outside does not howl dramatically like it does in films. It simply persists, quiet, patient, like a tax collector made entirely of ice. A weak orange glow pulses in the hearth. Not a roaring fire, nothing so luxurious. Just low coals buried beneath grey ash, carefully preserved through the night because wasting fuel would be foolish. Medieval families spent astonishing amounts of time gathering wood. In many villages, shortages became serious enough that people burned peat, dried dung, or bundles of straw instead. The modern fantasy version of the Middle Ages usually forgets to mention that everything smelled faintly like a struggling chimney. You step closer to the table. There sits a loaf of bread so hard it looks capable of defending a castle gate. You touch it cautiously with your knuckles. Solid. Completely solid. During particularly brutal winters, bread often froze overnight inside poorly heated homes. Not metaphorically frozen, truly frozen, like an edible brick. You imagine trying to make a sandwich with it and immediately feel grateful for central heating and modern dentistry. A child stirs somewhere behind you. The sound comes from a heap of blankets near the wall, except the blankets are not especially soft. They are rough wool, heavy with the lingering smell of smoke and bodies. Entire families often slept together for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all crowded tightly into shared bedding while winter pressed against the house from every side. The child coughs once. The mother wakes instantly. You notice how quickly her eyes open. Not startled exactly, and just practiced. She reaches toward the hearth without fully sitting up, adjusting one of the embers with a small iron rod. Even half asleep, she's protecting the fire. Losing it during the night could mean waking to frozen water, numb hands, and hours spent trying to spark new flame from damp tinder. A widely accepted historical reality is that medieval winters could feel relentless inside ordinary homes. Houses for peasants rarely retained heat well. Smoke from indoor fires often lingered because chimneys were primitive or non-existent. Some cottages simply allowed smoke to drift upward through holes in the roof. Romantic paintings usually leave out the eye irritation. You kneel beside the bread again. Someone has already attempted to soften it near the embers. The crust closest to the fire glistens slightly with moisture, while the other side remains rigid. You realize breakfast will involve effort. Medieval people frequently soaked stale bread in broth, ale, or hot water simply because chewing it directly could become a personal argument with mortality. Outside, dawn remains distant. The darkness beyond the shutters feels thick and heavy. Snow rests against the walls in uneven drifts. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a faint creaking noise, perhaps a tree shifting under ice, perhaps a cart left outdoors too long. Medieval villages sounded different in winter, quieter, softer. Snow swallowed movement and muffled footsteps until even familiar places felt uncertain. The father rises now, slowly. Every motion suggests stiffness. He pulls on wool clothing that looks permanently damp around the edges. Wool was one of the few reliable defences against winter cold, because it retained warmth even when wet. Linen beneath it helped somewhat, though not enough to stop the creeping chill that settled into joints and fingers. He moves toward the door but pauses beside the table first. The frozen loaf receives a tired glance that somehow contains both disappointment and acceptance. Like a man discovering once again that winter has continued being winter overnight. Historians continue debating exactly how severe some medieval cold periods became across different regions, especially during the early stages of what later scholars call the Little Ice Age. Climate records, tree rings, and surviving chronicles tell overlapping but incomplete stories. Still, nearly everyone agrees on one point. Ordinary families suffered most. The father opens the door. Cold air spills inward immediately. Not fresh air, not invigorating mountain air. This is hostile air. Air with opinions about your survival. Snow crunches beneath his boots as he steps outside to check animals and fetch water, before the bucket indoors freezes completely solid. You watch the mother meanwhile. She breaks off a small piece of softened bread near the hearth and places it carefully into a pot with leftover broth. Nothing is wasted here. Absolutely nothing. Medieval households reused food endlessly during winter months. Bones became soup, stale crusts became porridge. Even spoiled ale sometimes found second lives in cooking. A curious little detail survives in some regional accounts from colder parts of Europe. People occasionally warmed stones near the fire and wrapped them in cloth before placing them into beds at night. Primitive bed warmers, essentially. Comfort technology has always existed. Humans simply used to risk accidental burns while trying to achieve it. The child coughs again. The mother gently rubs his back without speaking. The silence inside the cottage feels strangely respectful. Everyone conserves energy in winter. Even conversation seems quieter. You notice the sound of the fire more clearly now. Tiny cracks, soft sighs from shifting embers, the faint hiss of damp wood surrendering slowly to flame. You settle yourself closer to the hearth. Outside, dawn slowly gathers somewhere beyond the frozen village. Inside, the family waits beside hard bread, weak fire, and another long winter morning that has only just begun. The door closes again with a dull wooden thud, and for a brief moment the cottage feels even darker than before, as though the cold outside tried to drag the light away with it. Snow clings to the father's boots where he stamped it loose before returning. A few flakes melt slowly near the hearth, turning instantly into muddy streaks on the packed earth floor. Medieval floors in poorer homes were often little more than flattened dirt covered with rushes, straw, or reeds. Fresh layers might be added from time to time, though fresh is doing generous work there. Over months, those floor coverings collected spilled broth, ash, animal droppings, and every mystery smell human civilization has ever attempted to ignore politely. You glance downward and immediately understand why winter dampness never truly left these houses. The cold rises from below as much as it pushes through the walls. The mother stirs the pot again. Thin steam curls upward, carrying the smell of onion, barley, and broth stretched far beyond its original ambitions. Medieval cooking during winter often became an art of endurance rather than pleasure. Ingredients disappeared slowly from storage bins while families learned increasingly creative ways to convince themselves watery soup still counted as morale. The child nearest the hearth reaches for warmth with both hands. His fingers are pink and swollen from cold. You notice tiny cracks along the skin near his knuckles. Winter did this constantly. Hands split, lips dried, feet blistered beneath damp wool wrappings. People worked through it because there was no alternative. A peasant family could not simply declare a snow day and remain under blankets watching historical documentaries about themselves. The cottage creaks softly around you. Now that your eyes have adjusted, you begin noticing how uneven everything is. The roof beams sag slightly overhead. One side of the wall bulges inward. The shutters fit imperfectly against the window opening, allowing pale lines of dawn to slip through thin gaps. Medieval cottages were rarely permanent structures in the way modern houses are. Many required constant repair. Straw thatch deteriorated, timber warped, mud plaster cracked after freezing weather. Entire communities spent large portions of the year maintaining shelters that winter seemed personally determined to dismantle. A commonly accepted historical fact is that most ordinary medieval homes had only one heated room. Everything happened there. Cooking, sleeping, childcare, mending clothing, eating, recovering from illness, occasionally arguing over whose turn it was to scrape frozen cabbage from the storage barrel, which must have been a thrilling domestic conversation. You move toward the far wall. Bundles hang from wooden pegs there. Dried herbs, a few strips of salted meat, garlic braided carefully together. The scent is sharp and earthy. Winter preservation demanded endless preparation before cold weather arrived. Family salted fish, smoked meat, dried peas, stored grain, and packed root vegetables into cellars or pits lined with straw. And yet despite all that effort, hunger still hovered nearby. You can feel it in the careful way the mother measures every spoonful into bowls. Nobody receives extra without reason. The adults especially eat cautiously. Medieval parents frequently reduced their own portions during harsh winters so children could have more. Love has always looked less glamorous than paintings suggest. Usually it resembles exhaustion holding a soup ladle. The father removes his gloves now, or rather, what passes for gloves. Thick wool mittens patched repeatedly at the fingertips. He rubs his hands near the embers and winces slightly as feeling returns. That peculiar ache of warming, frozen fingers is timeless. Human beings separated by 800 years would still make exactly the same unhappy face. Outside, faint grey light finally reaches the village. You peer through the shutter gap. The world beyond the cottage appears nearly colourless. Snow blankets, low roofs, and narrow lanes. Smoke drifts upward from scattered chimneys, though many cottages produce more smoke indoors than out. A dog moves silently between buildings, leaving delicate tracks across untouched drifts. No one rushes anywhere. Winter changes the speed of life. Even the church bell in the distance sounds muted by snow. Slow. Heavy, like metal itself has grown tired. A strange little belief circulated through some medieval regions during especially severe winters. Certain villagers claimed extreme cold allowed spirits or wandering souls to move more freely through the world, because frozen ground weakened the boundary between living and dead. Scholars still dispute how widespread such beliefs truly were, but surviving folklore repeatedly ties winter silence to supernatural unease. Honestly, after standing inside this drafty cottage before sunrise, you begin understanding how a person might hear one mysterious noise outside and immediately conclude ghosts were involved. The mother finally hands you a bowl. You accept it carefully. The broth is hot enough to sting your fingertips through the wood. Steam brushes your face with precious warmth. Floating inside are softened bread pieces swollen with liquid until barely recognizable. The frozen loaf from earlier has become breakfast by sheer persistence. You taste it. Simple, salty, smoky, better than expected, Honestly, hunger improves cuisine with remarkable efficiency. The youngest child watches you closely while chewing his own portion with slow concentration. You notice how silent meals remain here. Medieval families certainly talked, laughed, and argued, but winter mornings demanded energy conservation. Speaking less meant breathing less cold air. Besides, everyone is still waking fully from a night spent half shivering beneath shared blankets. The father reaches for a small wooden cup beside the hearth. Ale, not strong ale necessarily. More likely weak small beer brewed for daily consumption because water quality often proved unreliable. Even children drank diluted forms regularly. Warm liquid mattered during winter, and fermented beverages sometimes provided safer hydration than nearby streams contaminated by waste. The fire suddenly pops. A sharp burst of sparks rises upward. Instantly everyone looks toward the hearth. That reaction tells you everything. Fire is comfort, danger, light, survival, and constant anxiety altogether. Medieval homes burned frequently. Thatched roofs and open flames formed a partnership. Historians might politely describe as deeply concerning. You notice the mother already reaching for another piece of wood. Not large logs, those are precious. Smaller branches instead, fed carefully into the coals one at a time. Medieval families learned exact relationships between fuel and time, which wood burned hottest, which smoked least, which lasted longest overnight. Knowledge passed quietly between generations beside hearths exactly like this one. A modern person might imagine the worst part of winter was dramatic blizzards or violent storms, but no. The true misery was persistence, the endless repetition of cold mornings, damp clothing, weak daylight, frozen bread, smoke stinging tired eyes day after day until spring finally returned like a rumour nobody entirely trusted anymore. The child nearest you leans sleepily against his mother's shoulder. Outside, the village slowly wakes beneath layers of snow, while inside the cottage the fire breathes softly against the dark. Fighting another long battle, it must somehow win again tonight. The fire settles lower as the morning drifts onward, and already the family's thinking about night again. That is the strange rhythm of winter in the medieval world. Darkness never fully leaves your thoughts. Even during daylight, people measured time by how quickly evening would return and how much warmth could be gathered before it did. The father rises once more and lifts a wooden lid near the hearthstone. Beneath it rests a shallow compartment filled with ash and faintly glowing embers preserved from the night before. You realize this cottage contains not one fire, but several layers of survival hidden inside one another like secrets. Keeping embers alive overnight mattered enormously. Creating fresh fire from scratch was possible, of course, but it demanded effort, dry tinder, decent weather, and patience many exhausted families simply lacked after long winter days. So coals were protected carefully beneath ash, sometimes transported between homes, even borrowed from neighbours in emergencies. Few things announced domestic failure more clearly than admitting your hearth had gone completely cold. The mother adds another small branch. Not enough to waste heat through rapid burning, just enough to coax life slowly upward again. You notice how experienced her movements are. Nothing hurried, nothing careless. Medieval households depended heavily on invisible expertise, especially from women whose labour rarely appeared in official records but absolutely determined whether families endured winter safely. A familiar warmth begins creeping through the room now, though warmth remains a flexible medieval concept. You are not comfortable exactly. Your feet remain cold. The air near the walls still bites at your skin. Smoke lingers beneath the rafters, making your eyes sting faintly. Yet compared to outdoors, this cottage feels almost luxurious. Human standards adjust quickly when survival enters the conversation. The children begin folding blankets, or rather dragging enormous woolen masses into rough piles near the wall. The bedding smells strongly of lanolin, smoke, and sleep. Entire families sharing beds was not merely common during medieval winters, it was practical. Body heat mattered. You picture the scene after sunset, parents pressed shoulder to shoulder, children tucked between them. Maybe a grandparent near the warmer centre, layers of wool blankets above everyone while wind scratched softly against the shutters outside. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely existed for ordinary people. Even dreams probably felt communal. A well-established historical reality is that medieval peasant homes often contained very little furniture, a table, a few stools, chests for storage, perhaps simple benches. Bedding might be rolled away during daytime to create more living space. Everything inside the cottage needed purpose because space itself remained scarce. The smallest child wanders sleepily toward the hearth. He carries a little carved object in one hand, a wooden horse, crudely shaped but clearly loved. You're struck suddenly by how familiar the gesture feels. Childhood survives every century, even surrounded by freezing air and smoke-blackened beams. Children still drag toys around while adults worry quietly about fuel supplies. The father begins repairing something near the doorway. A leather strap, perhaps. You hear the faint scrape of needle through hide. Winter evenings frequently became repair seasons. Clothing patched, tools fixed, nets mended, baskets woven. Darkness arrived early, so families crowded close to firelight, completing endless small tasks while trying not to think too hard about how much colder January might become. Outside, snow slips softly from the roof in uneven clumps. The sound startles one of the children for a moment. That reaction makes sense. Medieval nights were loud in strange ways. Timber popped from temperature shifts. Animals moved outside. Wind rattled shutters unpredictably. Snow slid from roofs with sudden heavy thumps. In villages without modern lighting, every unfamiliar sound carried more weight because darkness concealed its source completely. A curious tidbit survives in some accounts from colder regions of medieval Europe. Certain families reportedly slept wearing nightcaps specifically designed for winter warmth, long-pointed cloth caps sometimes stuffed lightly with wool. Honestly, once you spend 10 minutes inside this drafty cottage, the idea begins sounding less ridiculous and more like the greatest invention in human history. The mother shakes out one blanket near the fire. Dust rises into the air together with the smell of damp wool. You notice tiny scorch marks along one edge where sparks once landed too close. Fire accidents happened constantly during winter months. Blankets smouldered, straw ignited, entire houses disappeared overnight. Medieval people feared cold deeply, but they also feared the thing protecting them from it. The father pauses his work briefly and rubs his shoulders. You can almost feel the ache settling into his muscles. Winter labour exhausted people differently. Not dramatic exhaustion from battle or travel. Just constant draining effort, carrying wood, breaking ice, hauling water, repairing roofs, walking through snow in heavy wet clothing. The body never truly relaxed. Scholars continue discussing how much sleep medieval people actually managed during long winter nights. Some evidence suggests segmented sleep patterns were common, with families waking for periods during darkness before returning to rest. In a world without electric lighting, people often adapted themselves naturally to seasonal rhythms, which sounds peaceful until you remember they were waking inside smoke-filled cottages beside half-frozen bread. The youngest child yawns enormously. His mother pulls him gently toward the hearth and wraps another blanket around his shoulders. You notice how instinctive warmth sharing becomes here. Everyone adjusts constantly around the fire like planets, orbiting a tiny exhausted sun. The room grows quieter, needles scraping leather, a fire softly breathing, wind touching the walls. You imagine evening returning now. The shutters closed tightly, darkness swallowing the village outside. The family gathering together again beneath blankets while embers pulse weakly nearby. Perhaps someone murmurs a prayer. Perhaps a story drifts through the room in low, sleepy voices. Medieval storytelling thrived during winter, partly because there was little else to do after sunset besides repair things and attempt not to freeze politely. You look again toward the heap of bedding against the wall. Tonight those blankets will hold every fragile warmth this family possesses. Breath, shared body heat, lingering fire warmth trapped inside wool, maybe even one of those heated stones wrapped carefully in cloth, and outside the cottage, winter will continue pressing patiently against the walls, waiting for the fire to weaken, waiting for dawn to feel impossibly far away again. By afternoon, the broth pot is nearly empty again. You stare into it hopefully anyway, which is one of the oldest human traditions during winter. Medieval families became experts at examining nearly vacant containers with irrational optimism. Perhaps another spoonful has magically appeared. Perhaps turnips reproduce when ignored. Perhaps the universe has decided to reward perseverance with unexpected cheese. Sadly, the universe remains committed to realism. The mother scrapes the bottom carefully with a wooden spoon and pours what remains into smaller bowls than before. Hunger does not arrive dramatically here. It enters quietly. Portions shrink. Bread stretches thinner. More water appears in the stew. Nobody announces the change aloud because everyone already knows. Outside, snow continues falling in slow drifting waves. Not violent, not cinematic, just steady enough to bury pathways and deepen silence around the village. The skies become a flat grey sheet pressing low over the world. Even daylight feels tired. You follow the father toward a storage shed attached loosely beside the cottage. The door groans when opened. Inside, the air smells of earth, onions, damp wood, and cold straw. Small piles of root vegetables rest against the wall beneath hanging bundles of dried peas. This is winter security, or at least the medieval version of it. A generally accepted truth among historians is that successful winter survival depended heavily on preparation during autumn. Families spent enormous energy storing food before the first frost arrived. Cabbages fermented into preserves, grain dried carefully, fish salted, meat smoked when possible. One poor harvest could haunt an entire community for months afterward. The father lifts a sack cautiously. Not much remains. You hear the dry shifting sound of grain inside and suddenly understand why medieval people prayed so often about weather. Modern society checks forecasts casually while holding snacks imported from 3 continents. Medieval villagers looked at dark clouds and genuinely wondered whether spring would include starvation. A chicken flutters somewhere nearby in complaint. You glance toward the corner and discover 2 hens tucked inside a rough enclosure beside the shed wall. Their feathers puff outward against the cold until they resemble irritated balls of wool. Even the animals seem offended by winter's persistence. The father gathers several onions and pauses thoughtfully before selecting only 1 turnip instead of 2. Every choice matters now. The cottage behind you exhales smoke slowly into the pale air. You notice other villagers moving carefully between houses, carrying bundles of wood or pails of water. Nobody lingers outdoors unnecessarily. Cold steals energy too efficiently. There is a peculiar detail found in some medieval household records that still feels strangely modern. During difficult winters, families occasionally hid small reserves of better food from visitors or even neighbours. A secret wheel of cheese, a hidden sack of oats. Human generosity has always existed beside human panic, and winter had a remarkable talent for revealing both. You return indoors with the father. Warmth greets you immediately, though the cottage remains far from comfortable. Compared to the frozen shed, however, the air beside the hearth feels almost luxurious. The youngest child has fallen asleep wrapped in blankets near the fire, one small hand still clutching the carved wooden horse from earlier. The mother begins slicing onions. The smell sharpens the room instantly. Your eyes water, perhaps from the onions, perhaps from smoke gathering beneath the rafters again. Medieval indoor air quality would have horrified modern doctors. Fires burned constantly inside enclosed spaces, and soot-coated walls, lungs, clothing, and ceilings alike. Some researchers point out that long-term smoke exposure likely contributed to widespread respiratory illness during winter months. Others suggest medieval people adapted somewhat to conditions we would find unbearable today. Either way, spending a single week inside this cottage would probably make modern visitors deeply emotional about ventilation. The father lowers himself heavily onto a stool. You hear his joints crack softly. Work never really stopped during winter. Animals still required feeding, water still needed carrying, repairs still demanded attention. Snow simply made every task slower and colder. Imagine trying to complete ordinary chores while wrapped in wet wool beside temperatures determined to punish exposed skin immediately. The mother drops stale bread into the pot again. Yesterday's hard loaf continues its heroic career as soup ingredient. Bread formed the foundation of medieval diets for rich and poor alike. Dark rye loaves were common among peasants, dense enough at times to qualify as construction materials. You remember the frozen crust from morning and almost admire it now. That bread has survived more hardship than many fictional heroes. The fire shifts suddenly. One ember tumbles outward onto the packed floor. Instantly, the mother reaches down and presses it out with practiced calm. No panic, just reflex. Medieval households lived in constant negotiation with fire. Every spark mattered. Every coal carried consequence. Outside, wind brushes softly against the walls. Not strong enough yet to become a storm, but enough to remind everyone how thin the boundary is between shelter and exposure. The cottage timbers creak in response. An unusual winter custom appears in several scattered medieval accounts from northern Europe. Some villagers supposedly placed bits of bread or grain outside during severe cold spells as offerings for wandering spirits or protective household beings. Whether people truly believed supernatural creatures guarded homes or simply enjoyed rituals that made winter feel less lonely remains uncertain. Human beings have always preferred stories to silence. The eldest child begins asking quietly about spring. Not directly, just small questions. When will the river thaw? Will the market reopen soon? Do birds remember where villages are during snowstorms? The adults answer gently but vaguely. Spring still feels distant enough to be dangerous conversation. Hope requires caution during hard winters. Promise too much warmth too early, and disappointment becomes another kind of cold. You sit closer to the hearth again. The onion stew thickens slowly. Steam curls upward, carrying scents of earth and smoke. Outside. Daylight fades already, though it feels impossible that evening has returned so quickly. That is winter's cruel little trick. The nights expand while supplies shrink. And inside this cottage, surrounded by rough blankets, thinning food stores, and the endless soft breathing of the fire, you begin understanding how medieval families survived not through comfort or strength alone, but through repetition. One more meal, one more night, one more morning beside frozen bread. Evening arrives quietly, slipping across the village in pale blue shadows while smoke thickens above the cottages. Inside this small house, the family prepares for night with the seriousness of people organizing a defensive campaign, because in many ways, that is exactly what winter sleep becomes. The father opens the door again, and this time the cold enters together with a cow. Not fully into the living space, thankfully, though the arrangement feels negotiable. The animal is guided into a narrow covered section attached beside the cottage wall, separated mostly by rough timber planks and optimistic thinking. Its warm breath drifts visibly through cracks in the boards. The smell arrives immediately. Strong, damp animal. You instinctively wrinkle your nose, but nobody else reacts. They barely seem to notice. Medieval people lived astonishingly close to livestock during winter months. Animals represented wealth, survival, labour, milk, and future harvests. Letting them freeze outdoors was rarely an option. A well-supported historical observation is that many peasant homes included attached shelters for animals, specifically because shared warmth helped both creatures and humans survive harsh weather. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs produced body heat that seeped gradually through walls and floors into living areas. Medieval central heating, essentially. Slightly louder and considerably smellier. The cow snorts heavily. Steam billows from its nostrils into the freezing dusk outside. You hear the slow shifting of hooves against straw, somewhere nearby. Chickens murmur softly in disturbed complaint as they settle themselves for the night. The youngest child grins sleepily at the sound. There is comfort in familiarity, even when familiarity smells like wet livestock. The mother hangs another blanket across the doorway to block drafts. Thick wool absorbs smoke and moisture until it hangs heavy as damp bark. You brush the fabric lightly with your fingertips and feel how rough it truly is. Medieval textiles were practical first, pleasant second. Possibly 15th. The fire brightens briefly as more fuel is added. Light flickers across the low ceiling beams. Shadows sway gently along the walls. The room begins shrinking inward emotionally as darkness thickens outside. Winter nights create intimacy whether people desire it or not. You settle closer to the hearth while the family prepares supper. Again the bread appears. Of course it does. This loaf has become the emotional backbone of the household. Hardened crusts are broken apart carefully with a knife and soaked in stew until chewable. You suspect the bread itself has developed opinions about survival. The father removes snow-crusted boots and rubs his feet slowly near the fire. The smell of thawing leather fills the room together with smoke and onion broth. Medieval winters assaulted every sense at once. Cold fingers, wet wool against skin, ash drifting through the air, hunger sitting quietly in the background like an unwanted relative who refuses to leave after holidays. There is an odd little detail preserved in some village accounts from colder parts of Europe. Families occasionally judge the severity of winter by observing how quickly ale froze indoors overnight. Imagine waking up, checking your drink, and calmly concluding the weather has become personally offensive. The eldest child carries straw toward the animal partition now. You hear soft rustling sounds as fresh bedding is spread for the cow. Nothing is wasted here. Straw serves animals, floors, insulation, roofing, and eventually fuel or fertilizer. Medieval households recycled materials with a level of efficiency modern societies would describe as an exciting sustainability initiative right before selling expensive candles about it. The mother finally sits for the first time in what feels like hours. Only briefly, though. Her hands continue moving even while resting, mending cloth, adjusting the pot, folding blankets near the fire. Winter survival depends heavily on constant small corrections. Ignore one loose shutter or damp blanket too long, and discomfort becomes danger surprisingly fast. Outside, wind brushes snow against the walls in soft whispering waves. The sound almost resembles distant rain. You look toward the shutters and imagine the village beyond them. Tiny pools of candlelight hidden behind timber walls, smoke drifting upward into black sky. Families gathering around weak fires much like this one. Entire communities enduring winter together while rarely speaking above quiet evening voices. Some medieval writers described severe winters as periods when villages seemed to disappear beneath silence entirely. Roads vanished under snow. Trade slowed. Travel became dangerous. The world narrowed to whatever existed within walking distance of your hearth. Researchers continue examining how much regional climate variation shaped medieval winter experiences. Some areas endured brutal freezing conditions regularly, while others faced damp cold and relentless storms instead. Yet across regions, One theme appears repeatedly in surviving records. Winter isolation changed people emotionally as much as physically. The children begin preparing bedding again. Blankets layered carefully, one wool covering near the bottom, another folded thickly at the centre, where the youngest child will sleep. The mother places warmed stones wrapped in cloth beneath part of the bedding, creating tiny islands of stored heat. You watch steam rising faintly from drying clothing near the hearth. Socks, gloves, simple linen garments stiff from cold and sweat. Imagine how exhausting laundry became during medieval winters. Water freezing, cloth drying slowly indoors among smoke and dampness. One surviving complaint from later centuries describes winter laundry as fighting the weather with wet fabric, which honestly sounds accurate enough. The father says something quietly now. Everyone laughs softly. Not loudly, just tired, warm amusement. The kind families share when surviving another difficult day together feels like victory enough. The cow shifts again behind the timber partition. Its breathing creates a slow, rhythmic sound beneath the crackling fire. Human sleep and animal sleep exist side by side here, separated only by wood planks and mutual dependence. You realize something strange then. This cottage, for all its hardship, no longer feels empty or bleak. Crowded, yes. Smoky, certainly. Cold around the edges always. But alive, every ember protected, every blanket arranged carefully, every crust of bread softened patiently beside the hearth. Winter survival in the medieval world was rarely heroic in dramatic ways. Mostly it looked like this. People staying close together while darkness pressed against the walls. Morning returns like an obligation nobody volunteered for. The fire survived the night, though barely. Beneath the ash, faint orange pulses still glow like tired eyes refusing to close completely. The mother kneels beside the hearth before anyone else moves, feeding thin pieces of wood carefully into the embers until smoke curls upward once more. The cottage feels colder than yesterday. You notice it immediately in your teeth. There is a strange sensation that comes with deep winter cold indoors, a feeling that the air itself has edges. Every breath brushes your throat sharply. The blankets release trapped warmth reluctantly as the family rises from sleep. Then the father reaches toward the water bucket and pauses. A pale skin of ice floats across the surface. Not thick, just enough to crack softly when touched. Still, the sight changes the mood of the room at once. Everyone notices. Winter has crossed another invisible line overnight. A firmly documented reality of medieval life is that indoor water freezing during severe winters was far from unusual, especially in poorer homes with limited insulation. People often woke to frozen wash basins, stiff clothing, and frost collecting along inner walls. Modern homes protect you from weather so completely that it becomes background scenery. Medieval houses negotiated with it directly every hour. The father breaks the ice layer using the handle of a spoon. The sound is surprisingly delicate. Tiny shards drift apart beneath the dim morning light while the youngest child watches with sleepy fascination. Children throughout history have apparently enjoyed poking frozen water regardless of century, empire, or available plumbing. The mother hands around pieces of bread warmed slightly beside the fire. Slightly, you bite into yours and discover the centre remains stubbornly hard. Yesterday's loaf has entered a new evolutionary stage. At this point, archaeologists might someday classify it as defensive architecture. Outside, dawn spreads slowly over the village. The shutters open briefly, and pale blue light spills inward together with a gust of cold so sharp it almost feels solid. Snow crusts the roofs. Smoke rises straight upward into still air. Somewhere in the distance, an axe strikes wood with slow, rhythmic knocks. Winter labour has already begun. The father pulls on stiff boots and prepares to fetch fresh water before the path freezes harder. You follow him outside, wrapping wool tightly around your shoulders. The cold hits immediately. Not dramatic pain. Worse than that. a steady consuming pressure that creeps through fabric and settles into your bones with quiet confidence. Snow squeaks beneath footsteps. Breath hangs in white clouds between cottages. The village looks smaller in winter. Paths narrow beneath drifts. Fences disappear. Gardens vanish under smooth white surfaces. Only smoke and movement reveal where life continues hidden beneath the season. You pass another cottage where a woman shakes frost from blankets outside. Nearby, two boys struggle to drag frozen branches toward a woodpile, while pretending not to struggle because medieval children also possessed pride. An unusual little practice appears in several northern European records from later medieval centuries. Some households supposedly kept chamber pots beneath blankets before sleeping, so the contents would not freeze solid overnight. Humanity's relationship with winter has always involved a surprising amount of strategic improvisation. Nobody puts into fairy tales. The water source lies near the edge of the village, a shallow well surrounded by packed snow and slippery ground. The father lowers a bucket slowly while ice creaks faintly around the stone rim. His hands move carefully. One slip here means wet clothing in freezing temperatures, which could become dangerous quickly. You notice how silent everything remains. No birds singing, no flowing water, only distant chopping sounds and the faint groan of trees shifting in cold air. Several medieval chroniclers wrote about winters so severe, rivers froze hard enough for travel and markets. In certain periods, people reportedly crossed stretches of ice carrying carts and livestock where boats normally moved. Climate historians continue examining which accounts may have been exaggerated by fearful writers and which reflect genuinely extreme cold events. Medieval weather records often blend observation with dramatic storytelling because apparently humans have always enjoyed saying, "You think this winter is bad?" Let me tell you about the one when fish probably froze mid-opinion. The father hauls up the water bucket. Ice crystals cling along the edges. His gloves are damp now, and you can almost feel the discomfort already spreading through his fingers. Wetness becomes an enemy during winter. Wool helps somewhat. Linen dries slowly. Leather stiffens. Medieval clothing offered protection, but rarely complete comfort. Back at the cottage, warmth greets you in layers. First a smell of smoke, then onion broth, then animal heat drifting faintly through the partition wall. The children crowd near the hearth immediately after returning indoors. One holds hands toward the flames with exaggerated desperation like a tiny worshipper greeting a fire god. Honestly, understandable. The mother hangs damp gloves near the hearthstone to dry. Steam rises slowly from them while droplets hiss softly against heated rock. You notice more frost along the inside edges of the shutters now. Tiny white crystals spreading across wood grain like delicate lacework. The eldest child begins sweeping the floor with bundled twigs, dust, ash, straw fragments, and muddy snow gather into little piles. Medieval cleaning standards varied widely, but households still fought constantly against dirt dragged indoors during winter months. Mud, ash, smoke, damp straw, animal smells, and soot formed an alliance against human dignity. A smaller detail from surviving household accounts mentions that some families slept with clothing inside blankets overnight, so garments would remain slightly warm by morning. Otherwise, fabric could become painfully cold before dawn. Imagine beginning every day by putting on freezing trousers beside a half-alive fire. Suddenly, modern alarm clocks feel less offensive. The cow shifts heavily behind the wall. The sound comforts the youngest child enough that he leans sleepily against the partition while chewing hardened bread softened in broth again. Outside, pale daylight struggles through heavy clouds. Inside, another winter morning unfolds through repetition. Frozen water, smoking fire, damp gloves, hard bread turning soft near the hearth. You begin realizing survival here depends not on dramatic moments of courage, but on endless, ordinary tasks completed despite exhaustion and cold. Every bucket carried, every ember protected, every morning endured before the next freeze arrives. By late afternoon, the clouds thicken again, and the village bell begins ringing somewhere beyond the snow. The sound drifts softly across the frozen landscape. Slow, measured. You notice how everyone inside the cottage pauses for a moment when they hear it, not dramatically, just instinctively, as though the bell belongs to the rhythm of winter itself. In medieval life, church bells organised time long before clocks became common. They marked prayer, danger, death, celebration, and the passing of ordinary days that otherwise might blur together beneath endless grey skies. The father pulls his cloak tighter. Tonight, he will walk to the monastery at the edge of the village with several others carrying small bundles of grain and candles. The monastery chapel offers evening prayer and, perhaps more importantly during winter, warmth. You follow him through the snow. The cold deepens as daylight fades. Snow crunches beneath boots in crisp, brittle layers. Smoke hangs low above rooftops. A few lanterns flicker faintly behind shutters, while villagers move carefully along narrow paths worn between drifts. The monastery appears gradually through the dusk. Stone walls rise dark against the pale sky, sturdy and severe. Compared to the peasant cottages, the place looks almost eternal. Yet as you step closer, you notice frost gathering between stones and thin smoke escaping from chimneys no more confidently than those in the village below. Even monasteries struggled against winter. A broadly recognised historical truth is that medieval monasteries often served as centres of charity, shelter, and food distribution during hard seasons. Monks copied texts, brewed ale, treated illness, and offered aid to travellers when weather turned dangerous. Of course, some monasteries were wealthier than others. A prosperous abbey might store impressive supplies, while smaller communities barely managed themselves. Inside the chapel, warmth greets you first. Not strong warmth, gentle warmth, the kind produced by candles, crowded bodies, and enclosed stone holding onto lingering heat. After the brutal cold outside, it feels miraculous anyway. The air smells of wax, damp wool, incense, and old wood. Candles flicker across carved beams overhead, while shadows stretch softly along the walls. Monks in thick robes move quietly between benches, their footsteps nearly swallowed by the heavy silence. You sit beside the villagers. Nobody speaks much. Winter encourages stillness even inside sacred places. The chanting begins slowly, low voices rising together beneath the stone ceiling. The sound feels less like music and more like warmth given shape. You close your eyes briefly and understand why medieval people clung so tightly to ritual during harsh seasons. Predictable words, familiar sounds, repeated prayers carrying through darkness while storms gathered outside. One curious custom from several monastic communities involved heated stones wrapped in cloth and placed beneath robes during especially cold services. Apparently, even monks reached a point where spiritual discipline benefited enormously from portable warmth. A child nearby falls asleep against his mother's shoulder during the prayers. No one minds. The monks continue chanting steadily, while candlelight flickers across tired faces. Outside, snow begins falling again in soft drifting curtains. Some historians continue questioning how deeply ordinary villagers understood formal religious teachings compared to local traditions and seasonal folklore blended into daily life. Medieval faith often mixed official church doctrine with older customs, winter superstitions, and protective rituals passed quietly between generations. Human beings rarely separate belief systems neatly when frightened and cold. After prayers end, several monks distribute cups of warmed ale. You accept one gratefully. The heat reaches your fingers first, then your chest. Steam curls upward, carrying scents of herbs and malt. Nearby, a monk feeds more wood into a brazier while villagers gather round it almost unconsciously. Everyone drifts toward warmth eventually. The father speaks briefly with another villager about frozen roads north of the river. Someone mentions a traveller stranded 2 villages away after a storm. Another quietly discusses dwindling grain supplies. Winter conversations always circle back to survival. You notice the monastery walls closely now. Though sturdier than peasant cottages, they are far from comfortable. Stone buildings trapped dampness fiercely. Wealthy monasteries sometimes hung tapestries or wooden panels to soften interiors, but cold still seeped through thick walls during severe winters. Sleeping inside unheated stone chambers must have felt like resting inside a polite tomb. A monk passes carrying a lantern. The warm glow catches drifting smoke near the ceiling. For a moment the chapel feels suspended outside time completely. Candles, snow, chanting voices, heavy robes brushing stone floors. Then someone coughs sharply. Reality returns immediately. Winter illness follows people everywhere. Smoke-filled cottages, poor nutrition, crowded sleeping arrangements, and freezing weather created perfect conditions for sickness. Medieval healers understood some herbal remedies well enough, but many diseases remained mysterious and terrifying. The father finally rises to leave. Outside, darkness has fully settled over the village now. Snowflakes spin through lantern light while boots press fresh tracks into deepening drifts. The journey back to the cottage feels quieter after the chanting. Even the wind seems softer somehow. You pass other villagers returning home carrying candles protected beneath cloaks, tiny moving lights crossing frozen darkness one by one. There is something deeply human about the sight. Inside the cottage again, the children are already half asleep near the hearth. The mother looks up as the door opens, relief flickering briefly across her tired face before disappearing into routine. Another log is placed carefully onto the fire, cloaks hung to dry, boots removed, bread softened once more in broth near the embers. The father sets a small blessed candle near the hearthstone. Its flame burns quietly beside the larger fire. Perhaps it offers spiritual comfort. Perhaps simple light matters during endless winter nights. Perhaps those things are not so different after all. The cow shifts softly behind the partition wall. Snow brushes faintly against the shutters. Somewhere beyond the village, monastery bells ring once more through darkness, while inside the cottage the family gathers close around warmth, prayer, and the fragile reassurance that morning will eventually come again. The coughing begins after midnight. At first it is only the youngest child, a small rough sound beneath the blankets near the hearth. The mother opens her eyes immediately, though you suspect she was never fully asleep to begin with. Parents during medieval winters learn to rest lightly, always listening for changes in breathing, movement, or weather. The fire is burned low again. Ash glows faintly red beneath blackened wood while smoke hangs in thin layers near the ceiling beams. The cottage smells heavier tonight. Damp wool, animal heat, ash. Human breath trapped too long inside enclosed space. The child coughs again, longer this time. The mother reaches across the blankets and touches his forehead gently. Her hand lingers there for several seconds. You can feel the worry moving quietly through the room without anyone speaking aloud. A great many medieval illnesses became deadliest during winter. Cold weather forced families indoors together. Smoke irritated lungs constantly, and poor nutrition weakened bodies already exhausted by labour. Fevers spread quickly inside cramped cottages where everyone shared air, bedding, food, and warmth. The father sits up slowly beside the hearth. You hear the faint crackle of stiff joints as he moves. Outside, wind brushes snow against the walls in soft scraping waves. The world beyond the cottage has vanished entirely into darkness and cold. Inside, all attention settles on the child. The mother rises and kneels beside a hanging bundle of herbs near the wall. Dried thyme, sage, something bitter smelling you cannot identify. She crumbles pieces carefully into steaming water suspended over the embers. The scent changes the room almost immediately. Sharp, earthy, slightly sweet beneath the smoke. Many medieval households relied heavily on herbal remedies passed through generations, especially during winter sickness. Some treatments genuinely helped soothe symptoms. Others probably offered more comfort than medical value. Yet comfort itself mattered enormously in a world where formal medicine remained limited and frightening. The child curls deeper beneath blankets. His breathing sounds rough now. The mother lifts the steaming cup toward him while murmuring softly. You cannot hear the words clearly. Perhaps reassurance, perhaps prayer. In medieval homes, those often blended together naturally. There is a peculiar detail preserved in several folk traditions from Northern Europe. Some families believed illness could linger inside bedding or rooms themselves during winter, so blankets were occasionally hung outdoors briefly in freezing air to cleanse them. Whether this reflected practical airing out or spiritual belief likely varied from place to place. Either way, the image of someone standing in snow aggressively disciplining blankets feels strangely relatable. The father feeds another branch into the fire. Tiny sparks twist upward. You notice how carefully he watches the smoke afterward. Too much smoke gathering indoors could worsen coughing badly, but allowing heat to escape through open shutters risked chilling everyone further. Medieval winter survival often involved choosing between competing discomforts and hoping you selected the less dangerous one. The eldest child pretends to remain asleep. You can tell by the way his breathing changes whenever the younger boy coughs again. Fear travelled quietly through families during illness. Not panic exactly. More like an awareness everyone carried silently because sickness could shift ordinary life into tragedy with terrifying speed. Several medieval chroniclers recorded winters where disease spread through villages almost as relentlessly as snowstorms. Cold weakened people physically while isolation delayed help. Monasteries and local healers offered remedies when possible, but many treatments depended on luck, rest, and whether the body decided to continue fighting. The herbal steam thickens around the hearth. The mother dips cloth into warmed water and places it gently across the child's chest. He shivers slightly even beneath the blankets. You feel the helplessness surrounding the adults now. They are doing everything they know how to do, which must often have felt unbearably small. The cow shifts behind the partition wall, slow breathing, hooves against straw. Familiar sounds grounding the room in ordinary life despite growing worry. Outside, the storm continues softly, without caring at all about human concerns. Winter rarely pauses for anyone's illness. A minor but fascinating custom appears in a handful of medieval medical writings. Some healers recommended carrying strongly scented herbs or flowers near the nose during outbreaks of sickness, because bad smells were believed connected to disease itself. This idea survived for centuries in various forms. Humans have always looked at terrible air and thought, honestly, that cannot be helping. The child finally falls into restless sleep. The coughing slows, not gone completely, but quieter. The mother remains awake beside him anyway. One hand rests lightly over the blankets while the other reaches occasionally toward the fire. You notice how exhausted she looks now in the dim glow. Shadows beneath her eyes, smoke caught in loose strands of hair. Fingers roughened from cold and work. Winter caregiving demanded relentless endurance. The father leans back against the wall, still awake too. He says little. Medieval fathers often spent winters fighting external threats such as weather, fuel shortages, frozen roads, and failing supplies, while mothers guarded the fragile health of the household itself. Both kinds of labour carried enormous weight. Some scholars continue exploring how ordinary villagers interpreted recurring illness during severe winters. Religious explanations, seasonal folklore, practical observation, and inherited remedies all overlapped inside medieval communities. Few people separated medicine from spirituality entirely because survival itself already felt uncertain enough. The fire settles lower again. You hear soft breathing beneath layered blankets, wind against shutters, occasional distant creaks from trees burdened with ice outside the village. The mother finally closes her eyes for a moment. Only a moment. Her hand never leaves the child's blanket. Inside this dark, smoky cottage, surrounded by herbs, embers, and winter silence, you begin understanding how survival was not simply about food or shelter. Sometimes it meant sitting awake through the night, listening carefully to someone you loved continue breathing. Several days later, the snow finally eases. Not completely. Winter is far too proud to surrender so easily. But the sky lightens enough for travel, and word spreads quietly through the village that the local Lord Steward will reopen the manor hall for grain distribution. The father decides to go. You travel with him before dawn across narrow frozen paths leading toward the hill where the manor stands. The air smells sharp and metallic. Frost clings to bare branches like powdered glass. Beneath your boots, snow crunches with dry, brittle sounds that echo strangely in the stillness. As the manor gradually appears through morning mist, you understand immediately why medieval nobles preferred stone. The building rises above the surrounding landscape with thick walls, towers, and narrow windows cut into pale grey rock. Compared to the cottages below, it looks invincible. Then you step inside and discover it is freezing. Cold gathers inside the great hall with remarkable confidence. The enormous stone walls hold almost no warmth. Drafts slide across the floor beneath tapestries hanging from the walls. The fire roaring in the central hearth helps, certainly, but only within a limited circle. Beyond that glow, the hall remains damp and chilly enough to make your fingertips ache. A frequently overlooked historical reality is that medieval castles and manor houses were often deeply uncomfortable during winter, despite their wealth and size. Stone trapped cold magnificently. Nobles owned fur-lined cloaks, thick tapestries, and larger fires than peasants. But many aristocratic residences still felt miserable for months each year. Several servants hurry across the hall carrying baskets of wood and steaming pots. You notice how everyone stays close to heat sources instinctively. Even wealthy people orbit fires like nervous moths when temperatures drop low enough. The steward stands near a long table recording grain allocations while villagers wait patiently nearby. Their boots leave melting snow across the stone floor. Voices remain subdued beneath the heavy ceiling beams overhead. The father removes his cap respectfully. You study the Lord's banners hanging above the hall while smoke curls upward toward dark rafters. Somewhere beyond a side doorway, musicians practice faintly on stringed instruments. The melody drifts through the cold air, sounding oddly delicate against the harshness of winter outside. One particularly strange detail survives from noble households during severe winters. Some aristocrats reportedly slept wearing layers of fur-lined hats and gloves beneath heavy blankets, because bedchambers became so cold overnight. Imagine possessing land, servants, silver plates, and political influence while still going to sleep dressed like a concerned turnip merchant hiding from weather. A servant passes carrying heated bricks wrapped in cloth. You immediately understand their purpose. Portable warmth again. Human civilization has apparently spent thousands of years inventing increasingly creative ways to say, "This room is unacceptable." The father receives a measured sack of grain at last. Not generous? Enough. The steward warns quietly that supplies must last until roads reopen fully in spring. Poor harvests and harsh weather have strained storage across the region. Several historians point out that medieval winters hit social classes differently but spared no one entirely. Peasants risked starvation first, naturally, while nobles worried about failed rents, restless tenants, frozen transport routes, and political instability. Cold weather disrupted entire systems, not merely individual comfort. You move deeper into the manor hall briefly while waiting. Near the hearth, Noble children sit wrapped in embroidered wool, watching a storyteller entertain them beside the flames. Their clothing is finer than anything seen in the village below. Fur-trimmed sleeves, dyed fabrics, soft leather boots. Yet even they huddle close together against the cold. A young servant girl kneels nearby, feeding branches into the fire one by one. You notice how red and cracked her hands look from constant work. Wealth in the medieval world often meant someone else carried the discomfort for you whenever possible. The hall smells different from the peasant cottage. Less animal heat, more beeswax and roasted meat. Still smoke, though. Always smoke. The lord himself appears briefly along the far side of the room, wrapped in heavy fur cloak. Conversation softens instantly around him. He walks with the slightly stiff posture of someone avoiding drafts. Medieval authority apparently included pretending you were not freezing while absolutely freezing. A fascinating custom appears in some noble households during harsh winters. Servants occasionally warmed beds with heated pans filled with coals before their masters retired for the night. The process sounds luxurious until you remember one careless mistake could transform bedtime into accidental castle fire. Outside again, the daylight feels brighter after the dim hall. Villagers begin the slow journey home, carrying grain sacks carefully across snowy paths. The father adjusts the weight against his shoulder, while clouds drift low over distant fields buried beneath white. You pass frozen orchards and silent fences half hidden by drifts. Smoke rises from scattered cottages below like tiny signals of persistence. Every home guarding embers. Every family measuring supplies carefully. The father speaks quietly with another villager about rumours from farther north where rivers supposedly froze thick enough for wagon crossings this season. Whether entirely true or slightly exaggerated hardly matters. Medieval news travelled through conversation, memory, and imagination all tangled together. Some researchers continue debating how ordinary people emotionally understood extreme winters before modern climate science existed. Did they see unusual cold as divine punishment, natural cycle, bad luck, a warning? Most likely different communities reach different conclusions depending on local traditions and recent suffering. Back inside the cottage, the children brighten visibly at the sight of fresh grain. The mother runs careful fingers through it before storing it away. Relief flickers across her face so briefly you might miss it if you blinked. The fire crackles softly. The cow breathes behind the partition. Outside, snow begins falling once more across manor walls, monastery stones, and peasant cottages alike, while every soul in the valley drifts closer to warmth in whatever form they can find it. The wind changes direction during the night. You hear it before you fully wake. A low steady pressure against the cottage walls, followed by soft rattling near the shutters. The fire has dimmed again, though not dangerously low yet. Ash glows faintly silver around buried embers while the room rests in heavy darkness, broken only by that weak reddish pulse. Beside you, the family sleeps in tangled blankets and slow breathing. The mother wakes first. Of course she does. Without speaking, she slips carefully from beneath the coverings and kneels beside the hearth. Her movements are practiced enough to seem almost ceremonial now. Ash brushed aside, tiny ember uncovered, thin branch placed gently across the glow, breath coaxing smoke upward. You watch the fire struggle back toward life. This happens every night, every single night of winter. A commonly acknowledged fact among historians is that maintaining household fires demanded constant attention in medieval homes. Without matches or modern fire starters, letting a hearth go completely cold created enormous inconvenience and risk. Families guarded embers almost like living creatures because, in many ways, they were. The wind pushes harder outside. You hear snow brushing against the walls in dry whispering waves. Somewhere above, the roof creaks softly beneath gathering drifts. The cottage feels smaller during storms, more fragile. The mother finally feeds a thicker piece of wood into the growing flames. Light spreads slowly through the room, touching rough blankets, hanging herbs, and smoke-stained beams overhead. The youngest child stirs but does not wake fully. Warmth reaches him before consciousness does. There is something deeply intimate about winter firelight. Not bright enough to hide imperfections, every crack in the wall shows clearly, every patched sleeve, every tired expression. Medieval evenings forced families into close awareness of one another, because darkness removed distraction entirely. The father rises next and checks the shutters carefully. Cold air slips through gaps around the wood. He stuffs loose cloth into one crack and presses a fur against another. Winter entered homes through patience rather than force. Tiny openings, gradual drafts, slow freezing. One wonderfully odd little practice appears in several medieval household traditions. Some people supposedly carry protected coals from room to room inside covered pottery containers, rather than relighting separate fires repeatedly. Portable fire, essentially. The medieval version of refusing to let your phone battery drop below 20%. The eldest child sits up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He moves automatically toward the hearth. Everyone does. The fire remains the emotional centre of the house as much as the physical one. Conversation gathers there. Meals begin there. Illness treated there. Winter measured there. The mother hangs another kettle above the flames. Soon the familiar smell of heated water and weak ale drifts through the cottage. Steam softens the cold air slightly, though smoke thickens with it near the rafters. Your eyes sting faintly again. Many surviving medieval accounts mention the difficulty of balancing warmth and ventilation indoors during winter. Too much open airflow drained precious heat. Too little trapped smoke and dampness dangerously. Medieval people understood these problems intimately, even without modern scientific language for them. Outside, darkness still blankets the village completely. No birds, no cots, only distant wind and the occasional muffled sound of another door opening somewhere beyond the snow. You imagine neighbouring families performing the same quiet rituals right now, stirring embers, wrapping cloaks tighter, breaking thin ice from water buckets. The father crouches near the hearth, now holding a small bundle of kindling. You notice how carefully he arranges each piece. Fuel calculation becomes second nature during hard winters. Which wood burns fast, which lasts longest overnight, which smokes too heavily indoors. Knowledge gathered not from books, but repetition. A small, fascinating detail survives from certain regions of medieval Europe. Some households believed borrowing fire from neighbours after sunset brought terrible luck, or weakened the spirit of the home itself. Whether people genuinely feared supernatural consequences or simply wished to discourage constant requests during fuel shortages remains difficult to untangle. Human tradition often wraps practical concerns inside dramatic stories. The youngest child finally wakes completely and immediately stretches both hands toward the flames. His fingers hover close enough to feel heat but not pain. You remember the frozen water from previous mornings and understand the instinct perfectly. Warmth here feels less like comfort and more like rescue. The mother tears hardened bread into a pot again. Always the bread, always the fire. The endless rhythm of medieval winter survival continues one repeated gesture at a time. Several scholars continue discussing how much communal cooperation shaped winter endurance in medieval villages. Some evidence suggests strong traditions of shared labour, food exchange, and mutual aid during harsh seasons. Other records reveal tension, theft, and competition when supplies ran dangerously low. Most likely both existed together depending on weather, harvests, and how desperate people became. The wind outside rises briefly into a hollow moaning sound. Everyone pauses instinctively. Then the cottage settles again. The fire cracks softly. The couch shifts behind the partition wall. Steam curls upward from the warming pot while shadows flicker gently across sleeping blankets not yet folded away. You realise something important then. The fire is never merely background in this world. It demands labour constantly, attention constantly, protection constantly. Yet it also gives shape to every moment inside the cottage. Without it, winter would invade completely. Bread would freeze solid again before dawn. Water would harden. Illness would worsen. Darkness would feel endless. The mother adds another branch. Flames rise brighter now. Around them, the family gathers closer while outside the storm presses against the walls with quiet persistence, waiting patiently for one mistake, one forgotten ember, one night when exhaustion finally wins. The howling begins far beyond the village. At first you mistake it for wind, a long wavering sound drifting across the frozen fields sometime after sunset, while the family finishes another thin evening meal beside the hearth. The children pause immediately. The father looks toward the shutters without speaking. Then the sound comes again, higher this time, clearer. Wolves! The youngest child moves closer to his mother automatically, though the sound remains distant. You notice how nobody reacts with surprise. Fear, perhaps. Respect, certainly. But not surprise. Medieval villages existed much closer to wilderness than modern towns do. Winter especially blurred those boundaries. Outside, darkness covers the world completely now. No moon tonight, only black sky and snow reflecting faint traces of starlight. The village feels isolated in a way modern people rarely experience. Beyond the last cottage, there are forests, frozen rivers, abandoned roads, and miles of unseen land where animals move through snow silently. A broadly accepted historical point is that wolves remained a genuine concern across many parts of medieval Europe, particularly during severe winters when food grew scarce. Attacks on livestock were common enough to shape village life and local folklore, though dramatic tales of constant wolf attacks on humans were often exaggerated over time. Still, hearing that sound outside changes the atmosphere inside the cottage immediately. The father rises and checks the door latch again. The mother feeds another branch into the fire. Sparks twist upward while smoke curls slowly toward the rafters. The children settle closer together beneath blankets. You listen carefully. Nothing now except wind against the walls and the slow breathing of the cow behind the partition. Yet the earlier howl lingers in your imagination. Winter nights encourage that sort of thing. The mind grows crowded in darkness. One peculiar belief from parts of medieval Europe claimed wolves could sense weakness or illness from extraordinary distances during winter. Whether people truly believed this literally or used it as cautionary storytelling for children remains uncertain. Human beings have always turned dangerous animals into symbols for larger fears. The eldest child finally whispers something. You catch only part of it. A story about a traveller lost in snow beyond the river last winter. Villagers found his cart later, but not the horse. The mother gently tells him not to frighten the younger children, though her own eyes drift briefly toward the shutters afterward. The fire crackles softly. You realize how much emotional weight the sound carries now. As long as flames remain alive, the cottage feels defended somehow, not safe entirely. Medieval people understood too well how fragile protection could be, but defended enough to breathe easier. Outside, another howl rises faintly through the night. Farther away this time, several medieval chronicles and village records mention organized wolf hunts during harsh winters when packs approached settlements more boldly. Communities sometimes worked together using traps, spears, dogs, and fires to drive predators back into forests. Winter survival was rarely an individual effort. Villages endured through cooperation because isolation invited disaster surprisingly fast. The mother begins telling a quieter story now to distract the children. Not about wolves, about spring markets. Warm bread. Travellers arriving with cloth and spices once roads reopened. You notice how her voice changes while speaking about warmer seasons. Softer somehow. Even exhausted people preserve small, hopeful visions during winter, because without them the darkness would become emotionally unbearable. A curious little custom appears in scattered folklore from northern villages. Some households supposedly carved protective symbols above doors or scattered ashes in certain patterns near entrances during long winter nights, believed dangerous for wandering spirits or animals. Scholars continue examining how much these practices reflected genuine belief versus comforting ritual passed through generations. Either way, fear becomes easier to manage once given shape. The father finally sits again beside the hearth. He sharpens a small knife slowly while listening to the wind outside. Not because wolves are about to burst dramatically through the door. Real danger was usually subtler than stories suggest. Livestock stolen, travellers attacked, isolated children vulnerable beyond village edges. Winter amplified risks already present. The youngest child has fallen asleep now against his mother's shoulder. His carved wooden horse lies forgotten beside the blankets. Firelight flickers across his face while smoke drifts lazily overhead. The contrast feels strange. Such ordinary peacefulness inside while darkness stretches endlessly beyond the shutters. You move closer to the narrow window gap, outside the village. The snowfields glow faintly beneath starlight. Forest edges appear as black, jagged shapes against pale ground. Somewhere out there, unseen animals move through frozen silence searching for food. Medieval people knew wilderness intimately in ways modern societies largely do not. Forests provided wood, game, berries, herbs, and danger simultaneously. Winter transformed familiar landscapes into uncertain territory. Quickly, once roads vanished beneath snow. A small but fascinating detail from medieval hunting records mentions that some villagers wore wolf teeth as protective charms or symbols of courage during difficult seasons. Humanity's relationship with predators has always contained equal parts fear, admiration, and questionable jewelry decisions. The wind settles gradually as midnight approaches. The howling does not return. Inside the cottage, blankets shift softly while the family prepares for sleep once more. The mother checks the youngest child's breathing carefully before lying down beside him. The father buries embers beneath ash to preserve them through the night. Every movement feels deliberate now. Outside, winter still surrounds the village completely. Wolves roam distant forests. Snow drifts across abandoned paths. Darkness presses quietly against timber walls. Yet inside the cottage, beside guarded fire and sleeping children, human warmth continues holding its small fragile ground against the cold. Morning arrives under a sky the colour of old iron. The storm from the previous night has passed farther east, leaving the village buried beneath fresh snow that glows pale blue in the weak dawn light. Inside the cottage, the youngest child is already awake, though only barely. He sits wrapped in blankets beside the hearth, staring sleepily into the fire as though expecting answers from it. Children in medieval winters learned patience early, not because adults intentionally taught it through wise speeches or thoughtful lessons. Winter itself handled the instruction, waiting for bread to soften, waiting for water to warm, waiting for storms to pass, waiting for spring. Childhood still contained games and laughter, of course, but it unfolded beside constant awareness that survival required endurance. The mother brushes tangled hair from the child's forehead. His cough has eased slightly. Relief settles quietly across the room without anyone naming it aloud. Medieval families often lived with uncertainty long enough that celebrations became cautious by habit. The father opens the shutter briefly. Cold light spills inward together with the smell of snow and wood smoke from neighbouring cottages. Outside, several children already move between houses carrying bundles of sticks nearly as large as themselves. Work begins early here. A well-established historical understanding is that medieval children contributed labour from surprisingly young ages, especially during difficult seasons, gathering fuel, carrying water, feeding animals, cleaning tools, helping prepare food. Survival depended on everyone participating according to ability. The eldest boy pulls on stiff boots now while the mother wraps wool around his neck carefully. He looks older this winter than he probably did last summer. Hard seasons age children subtly. Not physically perhaps, but in the way they observe adults. The way they stop asking for unnecessary things. You follow him outside. The snow reaches nearly to his knees in some places. He trudges carefully toward the woodpile, carrying a small axe more confidently than any modern parent would enjoy witnessing. Nearby, another child drags a sled loaded with frozen branches across the village path. Nobody complains much. There is no audience for it. One amusing little detail survives in medieval school records and household accounts. Children sometimes warmed wax writing tablets or ink near fires before lessons, because cold weather stiffened materials badly enough to make writing difficult. Imagine trying to practice handwriting while your classroom slowly transforms into a refrigerated monastery. The village itself feels strangely alive this morning despite the cold. Smoke rises steadily from roofs. Dogs bark somewhere beyond the frozen well. A woman beats snow from blankets outside her doorway, while two boys chase one another briefly before being ordered back toward chores. Even during severe winters, ordinary life continued in fragments. Games between tasks, stories beside work, laughter appearing unexpectedly and vanishing just as fast. The eldest boy gathers wood carefully from beneath a covering of snow-crusted cloth. You notice how selective he is despite his age. Dry pieces first, smaller branches for starting fires, larger ones saved for evening. Knowledge passes through observation here more than formal instruction. Several medieval educators and religious writers complained occasionally that children became restless and difficult during long winters trapped indoors, which feels deeply reassuring somehow. Apparently no century has successfully solved the mystery of young humans developing excess energy precisely when conditions outside are least convenient. Back inside the cottage, the younger children sit near the hearth while the mother repairs clothing. You watch her patch worn wool sleeves using thread so carefully conserved it almost disappears between her fingers. Medieval garments were repaired repeatedly, handed between siblings, altered, patched again, and eventually transformed into rags or stuffing once truly beyond saving. The youngest child begins carving lines into a scrap of wood using a blunt knife under careful supervision. A toy perhaps, or simply something to do while snow covers the world outside. The fire crackles warmly now after fresh wood was added. Steam rises from a pot of oats thickening slowly over the flames. Compared to earlier meals, this morning feels almost generous. You notice the children watching the pot constantly. Not greedily, hopefully. Winter sharpened awareness of food in ways modern abundance often hides. Medieval children understood supplies visually. Grain sacks lowering, salt meat thinning, bread shrinking. A curious practice from parts of northern Europe involved telling children special winter tales about household spirits who protected hard-working families but punished laziness during cold months. Whether these stories encouraged discipline or simply entertained restless children trapped indoors probably depended on the storyteller and the child involved. The eldest boy returns carrying wood bundled against his chest. Snow melts slowly from his boots onto the packed floor. His cheeks glow bright red from cold air while steam rises faintly from damp wool near the hearth. The mother nods approvingly without pausing her sewing. That tiny moment matters. Approval carried weight in households where everyone's contribution affected survival directly. Some researchers continue discussing how medieval childhood differed emotionally across social classes and regions. Noble children experienced structured education and privilege unavailable to peasants, yet even wealthy families faced winter illness, cold stone buildings, and seasonal isolation. Childhood everywhere existed closer to adult realities than many modern societies would consider comfortable. The younger child finally laughs suddenly at something. A real laugh, bright enough to surprise everyone. For a moment the cottage changes completely. Smoke-stained walls, frozen bread, damp wool. All of it fades behind that sound. The father smiles despite himself while feeding another branch into the fire. Outside, snow continues drifting softly through pale daylight. Inside, children grow beside winter one ordinary day at a time, learning chores, learning patience, learning how fires are protected through the night and how bread softens near embers by morning. The lessons are harsh sometimes, but there is tenderness here too, hidden beneath smoke and cold and endless labour. The family keeps building small moments of warmth around the children, so they may carry something gentler than winter into the years ahead. The market road remains buried beneath snow. You stand near the edge of the village beside the father while he studies the narrow frozen path disappearing into white distance. Normally, traders would pass through every few days during the season carrying salt, cloth, lamp oil, tools, and news from surrounding towns. Now there is nothing. No wagon tracks, no bells from approaching horses, only wind moving lightly across open fields. Winter isolation settles differently once trade stops. The village begins feeling less connected to the wider world and more like a tiny island surrounded by cold instead of water. The father exhales slowly into the air. Steam drifts from his beard while he adjusts the sack over his shoulder. Today he will attempt the journey toward a nearby settlement anyway, hoping to exchange carved tools and dried onions for lamp oil before supplies run too low. You walk with him. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots as the village disappears gradually behind drifting white haze. Bare trees line parts of the road, their branches black against the pale sky like ink scratches across parchment. A strongly supported historical point is that medieval winter weather frequently disrupted trade and travel for weeks at a time. Roads became nearly impassable, bridges froze dangerously, and storms isolated communities completely. For ordinary families, this meant shortages could deepen quickly once local supplies began failing. The cold feels harsher away from the cottages. Open fields offer no shelter from wind. Your cheeks sting. Even breathing deeply becomes uncomfortable after a while. The father pulls his cloak tighter but keeps moving steadily. Half-buried wagon ruts appear occasionally beneath the snow, evidence of earlier travel before storms reclaim the road. You pass a frozen stream where thin ice crackles softly near the edges. The silence surrounding it feels enormous. Medieval landscapes during winter often sounded strangely empty compared to modern environments filled with engines, electricity, and constant movement. Then finally, far ahead, you spot another traveller, a man leading a mule slowly through snow while wrapped in layers of dark wool. As he approaches, both men greet one another cautiously. Travellers carried valuable information during winter months. News moved through conversations more than written notices for most ordinary people. The stranger reports that grain prices have risen sharply 2 villages north. A cart overturned on an icy bridge earlier in the week. Several roads remain blocked completely. The father listens carefully while snow drifts around them in soft spinning currents. One odd little detail from medieval trade records mentions that merchants sometimes carried heated stones beneath blankets inside wagons during winter journeys to prevent certain goods from freezing solid. Human beings have apparently spent centuries inventing portable heating systems for bread and liquids, while personally remaining miserable. The road continues uphill through sparse woodland. You notice animal tracks crossing the snow here and there. Fox perhaps, rabbit, something larger farther off near the trees. The father watches those tracks automatically while walking. Medieval travellers stayed aware of surroundings constantly because isolation magnified every risk. Eventually the neighbouring settlement appears through the trees, smaller than expected. Several cottages clustered around a frozen well and a modest chapel. Smoke rises weakly from chimneys while villagers move between buildings bundled in thick cloaks. The market itself barely exists today. Only 2 traders remain beneath the rough wooden coverings, protecting their goods from snow. A few barrels, bundles of cloth, salted fish stiff from cold, lamp oil stored carefully against freezing. Winter markets often shrank dramatically during severe weather. Some settlements simply lacked enough safe travel for regular exchange. Communities learned to rely heavily on local production, and whatever reserves remained indoors. The father kneels beside one trader examining oil carefully. The smell is sharp and unpleasant, still valuable. Inside the nearby shelter, several villagers warm hands over a brazier while discussing weather patterns anxiously. One insists the river froze earlier this year than anyone remembers. Another claims travellers from farther east described entire forests coated in ice after recent storms. Some historians continue debating how accurately ordinary people remembered and described extreme winters before standardized records existed. Human memory tends to dramatize hardship over time, especially when communities pass stories between generations. Yet surviving accounts repeatedly describe periods of brutal cold severe enough to shape entire local histories. A child nearby gnaws stubbornly at hardened bread while sitting beside her mother. Even here, the bread returns. Medieval winter truly had one central character, and it was apparently determined to chip everyone's teeth. The father finally completes his exchange. A small flask of oil wrapped carefully in cloth. Not much, but enough to stretch candlelight farther through the remaining weeks of winter. You linger briefly near the brazier. Warmth brushes your face while snow melts slowly from boots. Nearby, a trader complains that frozen wagon wheels split more easily during severe cold. Another mutters about thieves targeting isolated roads once daylight shortens. Travel during medieval winters demanded constant calculation. Distance, weather, supplies, shelter. One poorly timed storm could trap people far from safety surprisingly quickly. A fascinating custom appears in several northern trading communities. Some merchants carried small bells attached to sleds or animals during snowstorms, so travellers could hear one another when visibility vanished completely. There is something oddly comforting about that image. Tiny bells moving through white silence while strangers search for roads together. The journey home begins before dusk. Nobody wants to remain outdoors after dark if avoidable. Snow starts falling again halfway back to the village, soft at first, then thicker. The father lowers his head against the wind and keeps walking steadily. At last the familiar cottages emerge through drifting snow. Smoke, light, home, inside the cottage. The mother immediately protects the precious oil near the hearth, while the children crowd close asking quiet questions about the market road. The father answers slowly while warming numb hands beside the fire. Outside, winter continues swallowing roads, slowing trade, and pressing villagers inward toward themselves. Inside, one tiny lamp will now burn a little longer against the darkness. The cold settles into clothing long before sunrise. You feel it while dressing near the hearth the next morning. The wool hanging beside the fire looks warm enough, but the moment you pull it over your shoulders, you discover the truth. Dampness still lingers deep in the fabric from yesterday's snow, not soaking wet, worse, half dry. That miserable state where cloth feels cold and heavy at the same time, as though winter itself has learned tailoring. The mother wraps layers around the children carefully before they step outdoors. Linen first where possible, then wool above it, patched and repatched through several winters already. Cloaks fastened tightly at the throat. Scarves wound around ears and cheeks. A widely recognized fact about medieval clothing is that wool served as the primary defense against winter weather for most people. It trapped warmth reasonably well even when damp, and could be woven thickly enough to resist wind better than lighter fabrics. Wealthier families enjoyed finer wool, fur, and layered garments, while poorer households relied on whatever could be repaired repeatedly. The youngest child complains quietly about itchy sleeves. You understand immediately. The wool scratches against your own wrists like determined little thorns. Medieval comfort rarely involved softness. Clothing focused on survival first. Fashion came later if resources allowed. The father sits near the hearth rubbing animal fat carefully into a pair of leather boots. Maintenance never stops. Cold weather stiffens leather badly enough to crack it if neglected. Shoes mattered enormously during winter, because wet feet could turn dangerous frighteningly fast. Imagine spending hours outdoors in freezing slush, while your footwear slowly absorbs every ounce of misery available. A small but amusing detail appears in several surviving medieval texts. Some people stuffed straw inside shoes during harsh winters for extra insulation, which sounds practical until you imagine explaining to modern footwear companies that the latest innovation in comfort technology is essentially agricultural feet. Outside, pale sunlight reflects sharply off fresh snow. The eldest child heads toward the woodpile again, carrying gloves with fingertips worn nearly through. You notice how carefully he avoids deep drifts where snow might spill into boots. Medieval winter clothing protected people imperfectly. One careless step could mean hours spent drying frozen socks beside the fire afterward. Inside the cottage, steam rises slowly from garments hanging near the hearth. The room smells strongly of wet wool now, heavy, earthy, slightly sour beneath the smoke. Medieval homes during winter carried layers of scent modern noses would probably describe as historically aggressive. The mother adjusts a cloak hanging beside the fire. You study the stitching closely. Different coloured thread from older repairs crosses the fabric in several places. Patches layered over patches. Entire sections replaced gradually across years. Clothing represented enormous labour investment before industrial manufacturing. Ordinary families preserved garments with astonishing care because replacing them required time, skill, and valuable materials. The youngest child reaches toward the fire while chewing softened bread again. Always the bread. At this point, you suspect future archaeologists could reconstruct entire medieval winters, purely from surviving complaints about hardened loaves and damp socks. Several historians continue discussing how regional climates shaped medieval fashion traditions differently across Europe. Northern communities generally favoured heavier layered wool garments, while southern regions adapted differently to colder months. Yet nearly everywhere, winter clothing balanced warmth against cost and practicality rather than style alone. The father finally pulls on the treated boots. He flexes them carefully near the fire first to soften stiff leather before standing. Every movement during winter required preparation. Boots warmed before wearing, water heated before washing, bread softened before eating. Medieval life contained surprisingly few convenient shortcuts. You step outside briefly beside the children. Cold air bites immediately through the gaps around your collar. Snow glare makes your eyes water. Across the village, other families move through similar routines. Cloaks pulled tight, gloves adjusted, faces wrapped against wind. Nobody looks entirely comfortable. Even the wealthiest villagers probably felt winter constantly pressing against the edges of their clothing, no matter how many layers they owned. One curious custom from colder regions involved sleeping with hats, specifically because nighttime heat escaped so quickly from uncovered heads inside drafty homes. The image of medieval families bundled beneath blankets wearing sleeping caps by firelight feels oddly gentle somehow. Exhausted, perhaps, but gentle. The mother hangs another damp garment closer to the flames. Too close risks scorching. Too far means remaining wet until evening. Winter housekeeping involved endless negotiation with moisture. Snow melted indoors, breath-dampened blankets, smoke clung to cloth. Fires dried things slowly while threatening sparks at the same time. The youngest child suddenly sneezes loudly enough to startle the chickens behind the partition wall. Everyone laughs softly. The sound brightens the cottage for a moment more effectively than the fire itself. A notable feature of medieval winter clothing was its weight. Layers of wool, cloaks soaked by snow, heavy leather footwear, belts carrying tools or pouches. People move through winter carrying literal burdens of survival across their bodies every day. You notice how the father rolls his shoulders after fastening his cloak. Not dramatic exhaustion, accumulated exhaustion. the kind built from months of cold mornings and heavy wet clothing. Outside, clouds gather again above the frozen fields. Wind brushes lightly across rooftops, sending powdery snow swirling between cottages. Another storm, perhaps, or perhaps simply another ordinary winter evening approaching. Inside, the family continues adjusting scarves, drying gloves, patching sleeves and warming boots beside the fire. No outfit here truly defeats the cold. At best, it delays discomfort long enough to finish chores before darkness returns. And somehow, through wool, smoke, and endless repairs, that proves enough to survive another day. For the first time in many weeks, music reaches the village before sunset. Not loud music, nothing grand. Just the thin, cheerful sound of a fiddle drifting through cold air while smoke rises from snowy rooftops. The children hear it first. Their heads lift instantly from chores near the hearth. Even the father pauses while splitting kindling beside the door. Tonight is a feast evening, a modest one, certainly. Medieval peasants did not suddenly transform into royal banquet guests because the calendar declared celebration. But winter feast days mattered deeply. They interrupted the long grey repetition of cold weather with light, warmth, and the rare permission to enjoy things without immediate guilt. The mother opens a small cloth bundle hidden carefully near the storage chest. Inside rests precious honey. Not much. Enough. The youngest child stares at it with the kind of reverence modern people reserve for treasure, or perhaps expensive concert tickets. A great deal of historical evidence shows that religious feast days and seasonal celebrations remained emotionally important during medieval winters, especially for ordinary communities enduring harsh conditions. Shared meals, music, storytelling, dancing, and candlelight offered relief from isolation and labour during the darkest months of the year, outside. Villagers begin moving toward the central clearing carrying covered dishes, candles, and bundles of wood. Snow crunches beneath boots while lantern light flickers softly through gathering dusk. You walk with the family. The air smells wonderfully different tonight. Roasting onions, fresh bread from the manor ovens, wood smoke mixed with sweet spices carried by one travelling merchant, fortunate enough to arrive before roads closed again. The village hall itself is little more than a long timber building with rough benches and smoke-darkened beams, yet tonight it glows warmly against the snow like a lantern buried in winter. Inside, people crowd close together around trestle tables. Children dart between benches laughing despite bulky wool layers restricting graceful movement entirely. One boy slips on melted snow near the doorway and recovers with the dignity of someone determined never to mention it again. The father exchanges greetings with neighbours while the mother helps arrange bowls of stew along the tables. You notice immediately that portions look slightly larger tonight, not extravagant, just generous enough to feel special. A delightful little detail from some medieval winter festivals involved people flavouring warmed ale with spices, herbs, or even bits of fruit when available. Essentially, the historical ancestors of every modern person who becomes emotionally attached to seasonal drinks once temperatures drop below comfortable levels. Candles line the hall walls, dozens of them. The soft golden light transforms everything. Smoke-stained beams seem gentler. Rough clothing glows warmly. Even tired faces appear softer beneath flickering shadows. The fiddler begins playing again near the hearth. Simple melodies at first, then quicker ones. Soon several villagers clap along while children attempt dancing on the packed floor between tables. Their boots slide awkwardly over damp straw scattered to absorb melting snow. Medieval celebrations often balance joy with practical floor management. The youngest child from the cottage finally receives a small spoonful of honey spread across warm bread. His expression becomes nearly spiritual. Honestly, understandable. After weeks of hardened crusts and thin broth, sweetness must have felt miraculous. Some scholars continue exploring how winter festivals helped medieval communities maintain social stability during difficult seasons. Shared celebrations strengthened relationships, reinforced traditions, and reminded isolated villages they remained part of something larger than individual hardship. Human beings endure cold more effectively together. Near the far wall, several older villagers begin telling stories. Not heroic tales exactly. Strange local legends instead. Snow spirits wandering frozen rivers, travellers hearing bells beneath the ice, monks encountering ghostly figures during blizzards. Children gather nearby immediately because every civilization eventually discovers that terrifying stories become significantly more entertaining beside warm fires. One especially curious medieval custom involved selecting a Lord of Misrule during certain winter celebrations, a temporary figure who encouraged playful disorder and absurdity before ordinary routines resumed. Humanity apparently invented chaotic holiday traditions centuries before office parties and ugly sweaters. The mother laughs quietly at something another woman says. You realise it's the first time you've heard her laugh fully in many sections now. Not tired amusement. Genuine laughter. The sound changes her face completely. Winter exhaustion often hides people beneath necessity. Celebration briefly returns them to themselves. The father accepts a cup of warmed ale from a neighbour, while nearby someone begins singing in low rough voice. Others join gradually until the hall fills with layered music, conversation, and drifting candle smoke. Outside, snow continues falling gently across the village. Inside, warmth gathers from bodies, food, candles, and shared relief. Even the fire seems brighter tonight. A historically documented feature of many medieval feast days was communal food sharing between households, especially in smaller villages where survival already depended heavily on cooperation. Rich families sometimes distributed extra bread or ale publicly during festivals as acts of charity or social expectation. You notice extra loaves near the centre table. Fresh ones, soft enough that fingers sink slightly into the crust when torn apart. After endless frozen bread beside the cottage hearth, the sensation feels almost unreal. Children begin growing sleepy gradually as the evening deepens. One rests beneath a cloak near the wall. Another curls beside her mother while music continues overhead. Adults linger near warmth, speaking more freely than usual. For a few precious hours, winter loosens its grip slightly. Not outside. The cold still waits beyond the hall walls with patient certainty. But inside, beneath candlelight and drifting song, the village remembers something important. Survival is not only about enduring hardship. Sometimes it also means protecting moments of joy fiercely enough that darkness cannot swallow them completely. The celebration fades by morning like warmth leaving a stone floor. Candles burn low inside the cottage while the family returns quietly to ordinary routines. Bowls washed, blankets folded, embers stirred back to life beneath ash. Outside, fresh snow has covered most traces of last night's footsteps already. Winter always reclaims the world quickly. The father steps outdoors before dawn and pauses beneath the pale sky. Something has changed in the air. Not warmer exactly, just different. Less sharp around the edges. The kind of subtle shift people notice only after surviving many winters. You follow him toward the frozen fields beyond the village. The snow stretches smooth and brilliant beneath weak sunlight. Trees stand motionless against the horizon while smoke rises from cottages in thin grey lines. Somewhere far away, ice cracks with a sound like distant thunder. The father says quietly that his grandfather once spoke of winters colder than this one. Longer too. Stories of rivers frozen solid for months and sheep found buried beneath drifting snow near the forest edge. Every village carries memories like these. Winters become legends surprisingly fast when survival feels uncertain enough. Modern historians and climate researchers have spent years studying what later became known as the Little Ice Age, a broad period of cooler temperatures affecting parts of Europe and beyond. Though timelines vary and regional conditions differed greatly, many communities experienced harsher winters, shorter growing seasons, and weather instability across several centuries. You kneel beside a frozen patch of earth where dead grass pushes faintly through the snow. It is difficult not to imagine how frightening shifting climate patterns must have felt without scientific explanation. One difficult winter could be dismissed as bad luck. Several in succession began reshaping entire communities. The father examines the sky again. Clouds drift slowly eastward like worn grey cloth pulled across the horizon. A strange but fascinating belief circulated through some medieval regions that unusual winters reflected imbalance in the natural or spiritual order. Comets, eclipses, failed harvests, bitter cold, all became linked in popular imagination. Human beings have always preferred connecting frightening events into meaningful patterns rather than accepting chaos politely. Back inside the cottage, the mother measures grain carefully into a wooden bowl. The supply looks thinner now despite recent exchanges at the manor. Winter consumption slowly eats through preparation no matter how cautious families remain. The youngest child sits near the fire, tracing shapes through ash with one finger. He draws little circles and winding lines absent-mindedly while the cow breathes softly behind the partition wall. The cottage feels quieter today, thoughtful somehow. Several chroniclers from the medieval period described unusually severe winters in remarkably vivid language. Frozen vineyards, starving livestock, markets stalled entirely by snow. Yet scholars continue discussing how much these accounts reflected actual climate extremes versus dramatic writing style common in medieval records. People then, like people now, occasionally enjoyed convincing future generations they survived weather personally designed by angry gods. Still, the cold itself inside this cottage feels undeniable. You touch the wall near the shutters and immediately pull your hand away again. The timber almost burns with chill. Frost gathers faintly along cracks where air seeps inward. The father begins repairing a wooden tool handle near the hearth, shaving rough edges carefully with a knife while speaking little. Winter often encouraged reflection simply because outdoor work slowed and darkness lasted longer. Medieval evenings stretched endlessly beside fires where people had time to think whether they wanted to or not. One particularly curious medieval idea claimed certain winters became harsher because forests had been overcut nearby, angering spirits tied to the land itself. While supernatural explanations may sound distant now, the underlying observation about environmental change was not entirely foolish. Human activity and climate have always influenced one another, even when understood through myths instead of science. The mother hands warm oat porridge to the children. Steam rises gently through the smoky air while outside snowflakes begin drifting down again, small and dry as ash. You notice the eldest child watching them through the shutter crack with narrowed eyes. Children raised in harsh winters learned weather almost instinctively. Snow texture, wind direction, cloud colour, tiny details predicting whether tomorrow would bring dangerous cold or merely ordinary misery. A broadly accepted historical insight is that climate shifts during colder medieval centuries affected agriculture deeply across many regions. Failed harvests increased food prices, weakened communities, encouraged migration, and sometimes intensified political unrest. Weather shaped history far more directly in agricultural societies than many modern people realize. The fire settles lower briefly before the father feeds another branch into it. Flames rise, orange light flickers across hanging herbs and rough blankets. The youngest child drifts gradually towards sleep again beside the warmth, one hand still holding his carved wooden horse. You wonder how many winters this family has already endured. How many more wait ahead? The mother adjusts cloth near the shutter gap to block another creeping draught. Such a small gesture. Yet medieval survival often depended on small gestures repeated consistently enough. Some researchers continue debating whether communities psychologically adapted to long colder periods over generations or simply endured them through necessity. Perhaps both are true. Humans possess extraordinary ability to normalize hardship when no alternative exists outside. The village disappears slowly beneath another veil of falling snow. Inside, the family continues repairing tools, measuring grain, warming hands, and protecting firelight against gathering darkness. The climate may shift across decades. Rivers may freeze earlier, harvests may fail more often, but here in this cottage, winter still arrives one ordinary cold morning at a time, asking the same question it always has. Can the fire survive until dawn again? The healer arrives near dusk carrying a basket that smells strongly of herbs and smoke. You hear her before seeing her. Boots scraping snow outside the cottage, a quick knock against the timber door. The mother rises immediately to let her in while the children stare with quiet fascination from beside the hearth. The old woman enters wrapped in layers of dark wool so thick she appears almost carved from winter itself. Snow dusts her shoulders. Frost clings to loose strands of grey hair escaping beneath her hood. And the smell. Rosemary, garlic, something bitter and medicinal underneath it all. The youngest child coughs again from beneath the blankets. Softer than before, but enough to concern the mother still. Winter illnesses rarely disappeared quickly in the medieval world. Families watched symptoms carefully, because small fevers sometimes became dangerous with terrifying speed. The healer kneels beside the child without ceremony. Her hands are rough and red from cold. She touches his forehead, listens to his breathing, then begins unpacking little cloth bundles from the basket one by one. A substantial amount of historical evidence shows that medieval communities relied heavily on local healers, herbal knowledge, monastery medicine, and practical remedies passed through generations. Formal physicians existed mainly in larger towns or among wealthier households, leaving ordinary villagers dependent on whatever treatments local experience could provide. The old woman tosses herbs into steaming water near the fire. The cottage fills instantly with sharp, earthy fragrance. The youngest child wrinkles his nose dramatically while the eldest watches with complete seriousness, as though witnessing sacred magic. Honestly, medieval medicine often looked suspiciously close to kitchen experiments performed by exhausted people surrounded by smoke. One especially peculiar remedy from medieval Europe involved placing warmed onions or garlic near beds to draw out sickness during winter fevers. Another suggested carrying strong-smelling herbs in pouches around the neck for protection against illness. Human history contains an astonishing level of confidence in vegetables solving catastrophic problems. The healer asks for heated stones. The father brings several from beside the hearth wrapped carefully in cloth. She places them near the child's feet beneath the blankets, while murmuring instructions to the mother about keeping his chest warm and the fire steady through the night. Outside, wind brushes softly against the shutters. Inside, the cottage glows orange beneath firelight while steam curls slowly toward the rafters. Shadows move gently across hanging herbs and patched blankets. The healer finally accepts a cup of warmed ale from the father. You notice her hands trembling slightly from age or cold or both. Medieval healers occupied strange places within village life. Respected certainly. Sometimes feared a little too. Communities relied deeply on their knowledge while also surrounding medicine with superstition, rumour, and half-understood beliefs. Several historians continue examining how much medieval folk medicine genuinely helped compared to later assumptions that all early remedies were useless. Some herbal treatments absolutely possessed practical benefits. Others provided comfort, ritual, or false hope. Yet even modern medicine still understands the value of reassurance during illness. The old woman opens another bundle from her basket. Dried lavender this time. She tosses some into the fire itself. Sweet smoke drifts through the cottage, briefly overpowering the usual smell of damp wool and ash. The children watch the sparks rise upward with wide, sleepy eyes. One curious winter practice appears in scattered records from colder regions. Certain families supposedly rubbed goose fat or animal grease onto exposed skin, believing it protected against frost and sickness, which sounds absurd until you spend enough time in medieval winter and begin considering whether becoming partially waterproof might actually improve morale significantly. The healer finally begins telling stories while the herbs steep. Not dramatic tales, practical ones. Winters from decades earlier when rivers froze hard enough for sled crossings. Children surviving fevers after weeks beside the hearth. Villagers trapped indoors during storms so deep, doors vanished behind snowdrifts. The mother listens carefully while sewing near the fire. You realise storytelling itself acts almost like medicine here. Shared memory, reducing fear. Proof that others endured difficult seasons before and survived somehow. The youngest child drifts towards sleep gradually beneath warmed blankets. His breathing sounds easier now. Whether from herbs, heat, rest, or simple passing time hardly matters to the family. Improvement is improvement. A fascinating little detail survives from medieval monastic writings describing sleeping apples. Heated fruits wrapped in cloth and placed near sickbeds during winter to release comforting scents overnight. Humanity has apparently always believed warm, pleasant smells might persuade misery to leave politely. The fire pops sharply. Everyone glances toward it automatically. Even during illness, attention never fully leaves the hearth. Heat remains inseparable from health in this world. Cold weakens bodies, dampness worsens coughs. Fire protects both comfort and survival simultaneously. The healer eventually rises slowly, joints stiff from age. Before leaving, she presses another herb bundle into the mother's hands together with quiet instructions for brewing it tomorrow morning. Payment comes partly in bread, partly in gratitude, partly perhaps in future help when winter eventually troubles her own household. Outside, snow has begun falling again. The old woman disappears gradually into the dark village carrying her basket beneath drifting flakes, while lantern light flickers softly around her boots. Inside the cottage, the family settles closer together beside the hearth. The child sleeps. The mother finally exhales fully for what feels like the first time all evening. Smoke curls upward. The cow breathes softly behind the partition wall, and through herbs, warmth, stories, and endless patient care, another winter night inches quietly toward morning. Night settles over the village with unusual calm. No storm tonight. No heavy wind scraping snow against the walls. Only silence. You step outside the cottage briefly after supper, while the family prepares bedding near the hearth. The cold greets you immediately, but softer somehow than earlier in the season. Snow lies smooth across rooftops and frozen lanes, glowing faintly beneath a pale moon rising over the fields. The village appears transformed after dark. During daylight you notice chores of smoke, mud, and patched clothing. At night, everything becomes quieter and stranger. Lantern light spills gently through shutter cracks. Chimneys breathe thin, drifting smoke into silver air. Snow softens rough edges until even broken fences seem peaceful from a distance. Your boots creak across the frozen path. The sound feels loud in the stillness. A documented reality of medieval winter life is that darkness shaped human activity far more intensely than it does today. Without widespread artificial lighting, evenings narrowed dramatically around firelight and candlelight. Most travel after dark became difficult, dangerous, or simply impractical during severe weather. A lantern swings faintly near the well at the centre of the village. Someone fetching water late, or perhaps checking animals. You cannot tell from this distance. The moonlight catches frozen surfaces everywhere. Ice along roof edges, frost-coating bare branches, thin white crystals gathered against shutter frames. The world feels suspended between beauty and hardship in that very medieval way, where both exist simultaneously and nobody has time to separate them neatly. From one distant cottage comes the faint sound of singing. Low, sleepy, a mother perhaps calming children before bed. The melody drifts softly through the cold air before fading again into silence. One unusual medieval belief claimed crossroads became especially dangerous during winter nights, because wandering spirits supposedly gathered where roads disappeared beneath snow. Whether villagers genuinely feared supernatural encounters, or simply understood that getting lost after dark in freezing weather was a terrible idea, remains open to interpretation. You walk farther along the lane. Snow crunches beneath your boots while smoke hangs motionless above the cottages. A dog lifts its head briefly near one doorway, watches you without enthusiasm, then curls back into itself beside the warmth of a stable wall. Even animals conserve energy carefully during winter. The chapel bell rings once somewhere beyond the village. The sound travels astonishingly far through cold air. You pause and listen as the final echo dissolves across frozen fields. Several medieval writers described winter nights as times when villages seemed cut away entirely from the wider world. Roads vanished beneath snow. Forests darkened into walls of shadow. Travellers disappeared from sight long before reaching shelter. Communities turned inward, relying on familiar voices and small circles of firelight. You pass another cottage where an old man sits outside briefly beside a lantern repairing fishing net by moonlight. His fingers move slowly but confidently despite the cold. He nods once as you pass. No conversation follows. Winter nights often encouraged quiet companionship more than unnecessary speech. A curious little custom appears in scattered northern European accounts involving candles placed near windows during long winter nights, supposedly to guide travellers or wandering souls safely through darkness. The image feels strangely moving now while standing among these tiny pools of light scattered across snow. The cold begins creeping through your boots eventually. Not sudden pain, slow persistent pressure. You turn back toward the cottage. Behind you, the village remains hushed beneath moonlight while smoke drifts upward into clear black sky. Inside the house, warmth closes around you immediately. The children are already wrapped in blankets near the hearth. The youngest sleeps with one hand still resting near the carved wooden horse. The mother adjusts bedding carefully while the father checks the embers one final time before night deepens fully. The fire burns lower tonight. Not from neglect, from caution. Fuel supplies must last. You sit near the hearth, listening to the soft breathing around the room. The cow shifts quietly behind the partition wall. Occasionally a coal settles beneath ash with faint cracking sounds. Outside, snow slides gently from part of the roof in a muffled whisper. Night inside a medieval cottage possessed a rhythm modern people rarely experience anymore. No glowing screens, no engines outside, no electric hum hidden beneath silence. Only darkness, breathing, weather and fire. Some historians continue discussing how medieval people psychologically experienced long winter nights without modern distractions or lighting. Storytelling, prayer, repair work, and sleep-structured evenings differently. But darkness itself remained a far more powerful presence in ordinary life than it is today. The mother finally lies down beside the children. The father stretches out near the hearth after placing another small branch carefully onto the embers. Orange light flickers softly across tired faces before settling lower again. You notice how close everyone sleeps together tonight. Not merely for warmth anymore, for reassurance too. Winter strips life down to essentials gradually. Food, fire, shelter, company. By February, those things begin feeling almost sacred through repetition alone, outside. Moonlight continues shining across frozen roofs and silent paths. The village rests beneath snow like something hidden carefully from the world. Inside each cottage, embers glow beneath ash while families drift towards sleep, surrounded by smoke, wool, darkness, and the faint hope that tomorrow morning might feel just slightly less cold than the last. One morning, something changes. It is not dramatic. No sudden thaw sweeps across the village. No miraculous warmth arrives riding golden sunlight like a heroic song from a travelling bard who charges too much for cider afterward. Instead, the father notices it while stepping outside before dawn. The air smells different. Still cold, Certainly, winter has not surrendered, but beneath the smoke and frost lingers the faintest trace of damp earth waking somewhere under the snow. You follow him into the pale grey morning. The sky hangs low above the village while thin streams of meltwater drip slowly from one side of the manor roof. Tiny sounds, easy to miss, yet everyone notices them eventually. Drip. Pause. Drip again. The children hear it next. The youngest runs outside, bundled in wool, and immediately points toward the hanging icicles along the cottage edge, where droplets gather before falling into the snow below. He looks at them as though witnessing magic. After months of frozen stillness, movement itself feels hopeful. A widely recognized feature of medieval agricultural life was the intense emotional importance attached to early signs of spring. Entire communities depended on seasonal renewal. Longer daylight meant future planting, reopened roads, healthier animals, and gradually expanding food supplies after difficult winters. Inside the cottage, the mother studies the grain stores quietly while preparing breakfast. Very little remains now. Winter has stretched long enough that every meal carries awareness of approaching limits. The bread beside the hearth is smaller than before. Even softened in broth, it barely fills the bowls. This final stretch of winter often proved hardest. Fuel low, food low, bodies exhausted. Yet spring still uncertain. The father leaves early to inspect fields near the edge of the village where snow has thinned slightly across exposed ground. You walk beside him through slush, beginning to replace powdery drifts. The sound beneath your boots has changed too. Less crisp. More wet. Messieurs, winter departing never looks elegant. One especially charming medieval superstition claimed hearing the first birdsong after a hard winter brought luck for the coming harvest year. Villagers in some regions reportedly paused work briefly just to listen for returning birds near thawing forests and rivers. Honestly, after surviving months of frozen bread and smoke-filled darkness, a bird singing probably did feel like direct divine encouragement. The fields remain mostly buried still, yet here and there patches of dark earth show through near stone walls warmed slightly by weak sunlight. The father kneels beside one such patch and presses gloved fingers into the mud thoughtfully. Around you, the world seems to hesitate between seasons. Ice clings stubbornly to shaded ground while water trickles beneath it invisibly. Bare trees remain lifeless silhouettes against the sky. Yet something subtle has shifted in the air itself. Several chroniclers from medieval Europe described late winter as the season of greatest uncertainty. Supplies dwindled dangerously while weather remained unpredictable. A sudden freeze after partial thaw could devastate livestock, damage roads, and destroy early planting efforts before they began. The father speaks quietly with another villager nearby. Both men glance toward the river valley where mist hangs low above the snow. They discuss thawing conditions cautiously, almost suspiciously. Medieval people trusted spring the way one trusts a cat holding a glass near the edge of a table. With hope. Yes, but also deep experience. Back in the village, children gather around dripping roof edges collecting falling ice pieces like tiny treasures. The youngest child bites one experimentally and immediately regrets every decision leading to that moment. Human history truly is a continuous story of people testing frozen objects with their teeth. Inside the cottage, warmth feels different now too. The fire still matters enormously, of course. Nights remain bitterly cold. Frost still forms along the shutters before dawn. Yet the room no longer feels locked completely against a hostile world. Occasionally the mother opens the door longer while shaking blankets outside. Fresh air enters without carrying immediate despair. A fascinating little detail from medieval farming communities involved special spring breads baked from remaining winter grain mixed carefully with fresh ingredients once available again. These first breads of changing seasons sometimes carried symbolic importance far beyond their actual ingredients. After enough months eating hardened crusts beside weak fires, Any fresh loaf probably resembled spiritual enlightenment. The cow behind the partition wall grows restless more often now. Animals notice seasonal changes quickly. Chickens mutter louder near dawn. Dogs linger outdoors longer before returning to warmth. Even the smoke rising from village chimneys smells different in dampening air. Some historians continue debating how accurately medieval communities could predict seasonal change based on environmental signs alone. Yet surviving agricultural traditions reveal generations of close observation regarding weather, animal behaviour, thaw patterns, and daylight shifts. People who depended directly on land became attentive in ways modern life rarely requires. That evening the family gathers outside briefly before sunset, a dangerous amount of optimism for February. The sky glows pale gold above the snowy fields while water drips steadily from roof edges into darkening slush below. The youngest child points excitedly toward distant birds crossing overhead in uneven formation. The mother smiles, tired still, but hopeful. Inside the cottage later, the fire burns lower than usual because less fuel is needed tonight. Not much less, just enough to notice. You sit beside the hearth listening to soft conversation, thawing water outside, and the gentle breathing of a family that has nearly reached the far edge of winter. The bread remains hard. The blankets remain rough. The smoke still stings your eyes, yet somewhere beneath the frozen earth beyond the village, spring has already begun moving quietly upward toward the light. Morning arrives softly at last. Not warm, not bright, but softer. The cottage wakes beneath pale spring light filtering through the shutters while the fire crackles quietly beside the hearth. Smoke still hangs near the rafters, blankets still smell of wool and long winter nights, yet the air no longer bites quite so sharply inside your lungs. The youngest child sits nearest the fire holding a piece of bread in both hands. Fresh bread. Not perfectly fresh, perhaps. Medieval standards remain humble, but softer than the frozen loaves from earlier weeks. When he tears it apart, steam rises faintly from the centre. The entire room notices. A carefully supported historical observation is that the arrival of spring altered medieval household rhythms almost immediately. Roads reopened gradually, trade resumed, livestock improved, daylight extended working hours. Even modest dietary changes after winter scarcity could feel transformative to ordinary families. The mother smiles while ladling warm broth into bowls. The expression appears briefly, almost shyly, as though she does not entirely trust relief yet. After surviving difficult winters, people learned caution. One late frost could still damage crops. One storm could still return unexpectedly. But for now, the snow outside has begun retreating from the edges of the village paths. You step outdoors with the father. Water drips steadily from roof lines into muddy ground below. The frozen stream beyond the cottages now moves beneath cracked ice. Dark water gliding slowly through widening channels. Birds flicker between bare branches overhead while smoke rises into gentler air. The village sounds different, alive again. Axes striking wood, dogs barking, someone laughing near the well. Wheels creaking from a cart carefully testing softened roads. After months of muffled winter silence, ordinary noise feels strangely joyful. One curious medieval custom connected to early spring involved villagers carrying greenery or fresh branches into homes as symbols of renewal after hard winters. Imagine surviving months beside smoke, frozen water, and stale bread, then suddenly decorating your house because a leaf appeared somewhere. Honestly, completely understandable behaviour. The father kneels beside the edge of a field where patches of earth now emerge through melting snow. Mud clings heavily to his boots. He presses rough fingers into the soil thoughtfully while nearby other villagers inspect fences damaged by winter storms. There is still enormous work ahead. Repairing roofs, preparing fields, mending tools. Winter never truly ended with celebration. It dissolved gradually into labour. Several historians continue exploring how medieval communities emotionally marked seasonal transition after severe winters. Religious festivals, agricultural rituals, practical tasks, and local traditions all blended together differently depending on region and climate. Yet nearly every surviving account suggests one common truth. Spring carried profound psychological relief. Back inside the cottage, Mother opens the shutters wider than usual. Sunlight spills across the packed earth floor in pale golden strips. The children squint toward it like small animals emerging cautiously after hibernation. The youngest child abandons his bread temporarily just to stand in the sunlight. You notice dust floating through the beam, slowly above his hair, while the fire glows lower beside him. For the first time in many weeks, warmth enters the cottage from somewhere besides the hearth. A small but delightful detail from medieval writings mentions people airing bedding and clothing outdoors eagerly once weather softened, partly for cleanliness, and partly because months of smoke and dampness left everything smelling deeply historical. The mother carries blankets outside one by one. She shakes them vigorously beneath open sky, while cold, clean air rushes through wool heavy from winter use. Nearby, other villagers do the same. Across the settlement, cloth hangs from fences and roof edges like banners celebrating survival itself. The fire inside burns lower now. Not neglected, simply less desperate. You realize the family no longer crowds around it constantly. The eldest child sits near the doorway carving wood while listening to birds outside. The father repairs harness straps near open light instead of leaning close beside embers. Winter shaped every movement inside this cottage for months. Now spring slowly reshapes them again. Some researchers continue discussing how medieval seasonal life affected memory and storytelling across generations. Harsh winters became legends. Mild springs became blessings. Families measured years through weather because weather measured survival. The youngest child suddenly runs outdoors without his cloak. The mother calls after him immediately. He returns moments later, laughing breathlessly while clutching a tiny cluster of green shoots discovered beside the wall where snow melted first. Everyone gathers round to look. Such small, fragile things. Yet the room changes around them instantly. The father smiles openly now. The eldest child touches one leaf carefully with soot-stained fingers. Even the mother laughs softly while shaking her head at the excitement. Outside, meltwater runs through village paths in silver streams beneath pale sunlight. The frozen world has not vanished completely. Snow still lingers in shaded places. Nights will remain cold for weeks yet. But winter has loosened its grip. The bread softens beside the hearth without freezing solid again overnight. The shutters open wider each morning. And inside this little smoke-darkened cottage where one family endured cold, hunger, fear, coughing nights, drifting snow, frozen water, and endless hard bread, life begins stretching slowly toward warmth once more. The fire crackles quietly behind you. Children laugh outside. Water drips from the roof. And at last, after so many long winter nights, the village breathes easier. The day grows softer now. You remain near the cottage while evening settles gently across the village, no longer heavy with deep winter silence, but touched instead by the slow, patient sounds of thawing earth and distant running water. Smoke drifts upward from chimneys into fading gold light. Somewhere nearby, a bird continues singing long after it should reasonably have gone to sleep, as though even it cannot quite believe the cold is finally loosening. Inside, the family prepares for night once more, but everything feels different. The blankets still carry the scent of smoke and wool, yet they hang lighter now after airing beneath the sky. The fire burns lower, calmer, no longer fighting desperately against frozen darkness beyond the walls. Even the bread beside the hearth rests soft enough to tear easily between tired fingers. You watch the youngest child fall asleep before the embers with one small hand curled around the carved wooden horse. His breathing is quiet and easy now. The mother rests nearby with her eyes half closed while the father checks the door one last time against the cool spring night air. Outside, snow continues melting slowly from the fields, drop by drop, sound by sound. The world wakes carefully after winter, as though afraid to move too quickly and summon the cold again. Yet the village remains standing, the fires survived, the people endured, and now, as darkness settles softly around the cottage and the last orange glow flickers across the rafters overhead, you allow yourself to rest there beside them a little longer, wrapped in warmth, smoke, and the comforting knowledge that even the longest winters eventually surrenders to morning. Sweet dreams.